The clinical observation is unambiguous. What the modern world diagnoses as burnout or a midlife crisis is, in reality, a profound systemic failure of the personality structure. It is an epidemic of neurosis brought about by the successful execution of a psychological lie. The patient arrives successful, often admired, fully invested in the life society guaranteed would yield satisfaction, yet he describes a terminal vacancy. Things that once generated psychic energy, the career milestones, the acquisition of status, the social recognition, now register as null, zero. This is not mere fatigue. This is existential exhaustion. We are observing the death rattle of the persona. The persona is the functional mask, the necessary compromise between the individual's inner reality and the demands of the collective. It is useful, but it is never the self. The tragedy of modern life is that the individual, in their zeal to achieve external success, mistakes the mask for the face. They pour their entire psychic reserve into maintaining a flawless facade, believing the applause of the crowd is the same thing as inner vitality. When the internal self, the seek, finally rebels against this suffocating constriction, the symptoms are brutal. The patient feels like a ghost wandering his own life, forced to fake enthusiasm for achievements that hold no subjective value. It is the cold, hard truth that the story they told themselves about who they were has simply stopped working. This emptiness is terrifying because it strikes at the very foundation of identity. It is the seek initiating a forced demolition. The structure built on sand, the carefully constructed external identity, is collapsing. Understand this clearly. The erosion of the persona is not depression, though it wears depression's clothing. Depression has weight, texture, and often a clear causal link to repressed contents or unresolved grief. This clinical state is the absence of weight. It is the psychic equivalent of a vacuum. It is the necessary dissolution preceding the night sea journey. The modern tendency to pathologize this necessary disintegration is a dangerous error. Society, driven by its fear of chaos and its obsession with functional stability, demands a quick fix. They prescribe medication, superficial coping mechanisms, or therapy focused solely on getting back to normal. This approach is psychological poison. To medicate away the discomfort, to force the individual back into the rigid patterns of the old self, is to commit a form of psychological suicide. You cannot heal a structure that is fundamentally unsound by pretending the cracks aren't there. If you interrupt the voluntary, painful process of dissolution, the seek will eventually force an involuntary, catastrophic breakdown. The individual who refuses to walk into the fire of transformation will find the fire coming to them later, often manifest as severe physical illness, acute neurosis, or the complete takeover by complexes autonomos, those powerful splintered fragments of the self that operate with a will of their own. My clinical observations across decades showed this pattern is mapped with terrifying precision. The dissolution begins with the quiet withdrawal of projections. You stop caring what others think. This is not the healthy boundary setting that comes with maturity. This is a destabilizing, frightening realization. The social scaffolding that held your identity together, the approval of your parents, the respect of your colleagues, the envy of your peers, suddenly loses all its psychic adhesive power. It just falls away. Imagine standing naked in a crowded room. That is the feeling. You realize with chilling clarity that you have spent decades performing for an audience that was never truly watching you, only watching the persona you presented. You sacrificed authentic desire for conditional approval that ultimately was meaningless. This revelation should be liberating, but initially it is pure terror. Without those external reference points, the individual simply does not know who they are. The ground beneath their feet vanishes. Every conversation becomes a draining calculation, a performance where they have forgotten the script. The energy required for even minor social interaction becomes astronomical, because the automatic, unconscious mask is gone. The patient is left exposed, vulnerable, and utterly lost in the void created by their own success. This collapse of external meaning initiates the second, far more treacherous phase, the return of the sombra. When the persona cracks open like an eggshell, the contents that were repressed, denied, and exiled from consciousness flood back in. This is the shadow, the repository of all the moral and instinctual filth, the unlived life, the primal drives, and the morally questionable thoughts that the individual spent a lifetime hiding, not just from others, but from themselves. The psyche demands payment for the years of repression. The individual must now confront the darkness they denied. They must face the terrifying realization that they are capable of things they judged in others, that their instincts are far more primitive than their civilized persona ever allowed them to admit. This confrontation is non-negotiable. It is the price of consciousness. The collapse of the old self is not the end of the line. It is the checkpoint. The structure has failed. The question is whether you will cling to the ruins and live out your days as a neurotic ghost, or whether you will accept the psychological death that clears the ground for the birth of the actual individual. The choice is stark. Confront the shadow and initiate the painful, lonely process of individuation, or retreat into the collective delusion and surrender to the inevitable, forced breakdown. There is no middle ground. The time for pretending is over. The persona is not some light-hearted social metaphor. It is a necessary, rigid psychic structure, a survival mechanism forged in the fires of childhood dependency and collective pressure. Clinically, we must see it as the compromise between the individual ego and the demands of society. It is the specific role you chose or were forced into to ensure you were fed, loved, or at least tolerated by the tribe. The persona is the successful accountant, the devoted mother, the intellectual cynic, the fearless athlete. It is the polished surface that allows the individual to operate without provoking the collective's judgment. But here is the cold, hard truth. The moment you begin to believe that the mask is your face, the neurosis has already set in. The structure of the psyche demands balance. This is a law of nature, brutal and unforgiving, like physics. For every quality the individual consciously embraces and displays through the persona, discipline, morality, rationality, the exact opposite quality must be violently repressed into the unconscious. This is the compensatory mechanism that creates the sombra. The more idealized, perfect, and rigid the persona becomes, the darker, more chaotic, and more volatile the shadow grows. It is a zero-sum game. If you strive your entire life to be the good person, the one who never gets angry, who always submits, who is morally impeccable, you are simultaneously cultivating a reservoir of rage, resentment, and brutal instinctual drives beneath the surface. This repressed material does not simply vanish. It coagulates, it organizes itself, and eventually, it forms what I call complexos autonomos. These are not mere bad habits or forgotten memories. These are splinter personalities, psychic fragments that have split off from the conscious ego and now possess their own destructive will. They are traumas with a vote. They are the contents of the shadow that operate outside the control of the conscious mind, waiting for the structural failure of the persona to burst forth and wreak havoc. Look around at the modern epidemic of sudden, inexplicable breakdowns. The respected executive who suddenly throws away his career for a reckless impulse. The devout moralist caught in a scandal of shocking depravity. These are not failures of character. They are structural failures of the psyche. The persona, that carefully constructed dam, has cracked under the pressure of the unlived life, and the autonomous complex rushes through the breach. The danger of deep identification with the persona is absolute disconnection from internal reality. The individual becomes a mere function of society. They know how to perform their job, how to attend to their social duties, how to articulate the acceptable collective opinions, but they lose all contact with their instinctual foundation, with the primal drives that fuel genuine life. They become hollow men, animated by the expectations of others. When the external framework of the persona inevitably fails, when the job is lost, when the children leave, when the social status is revoked, there is nothing left. The individual finds themselves standing naked in a psychological vacuum. They realize they have sacrificed their authentic desires, their true voice, and their instinctual wisdom for conditional approval that was ultimately meaningless. This is the psychological suicide committed by the identification with the mask. The feeling of emptiness described by the patient, the sense that everything is suddenly gray and without texture, is the sound of the persona dissolving. That numbness is the result of decades spent filtering every genuine impulse through the rigid sieve of the social role. Nothing can get in, and nothing authentic can get out. The modern response, of course, is to panic and attempt to patch the persona back together. We see this in the frantic search for a new title, a new partner, a new ideology, or a new identity that can quickly replace the shattered old one. People run back to the familiar, desperate to avoid the terrifying silence of the inner void. They try to medicate the discomfort away, to silence the internal clamor of the returning shadow. This is a catastrophic error. You cannot escape the debt owed to the unconscious. If you refuse the voluntary sacrifice of the persona, the psychological death that is necessary for growth, the psyche will simply escalate the demand. It will enforce the collapse through non-negotiable means: chronic neurosis, physical illness, or a complete mental breakdown that renders the individual socially paralyzed. The psyche will not be denied its need for integration. The nigredo, the dark night, the sea journey, is the structure burning down. It is terrifying because you are losing the only identity you have ever known. But if you cling to the ruins, you will live out your days as a neurotic ghost, haunting the halls of a life that was never truly yours. The task is not to fix the persona. The task is to stand in the rubble, acknowledge the face of the shadow that emerges from the darkness, and begin the lonely, difficult work of integration. This requires moral courage that most people simply do not possess. It demands that you confront the realization that you are not the hero you pretended to be, and that you are capable of the same moral filth you condemn in others. This confrontation is the only path forward. Refuse it, and you are condemning yourself to a life ruled by autonomous complexes that will eventually drag you into the abyss. The time for pretense is over. You must let the old self die, or it will eventually kill the possibility of the true self being born. The refusal to confront the shadow leaves the individual vulnerable to a far more dangerous phenomenon: the tyranny of the autonomous complex. We must understand this clinically. When I speak of a complex, I am not referring to a mere feeling of inadequacy, as the common tongue uses the word. I am describing a highly energized, emotionally charged cluster of ideas and memories that has split off from the conscious ego. These fragments are not passive. They are structured wounds that possess a frightening degree of independence. They behave like secondary personalities, psychological tumors with their own will, their own memory, and their own destructive agenda. This is the cold, hard truth about the human psyche. You are rarely the driver of your own life. You are, more often than not, a passenger kidnapped by these internal tyrants. The fundamental neurosis of modern man stems from this delusion of control. We believe our decisions are rational and self-directed. We write down our goals. We attend seminars. We swear we will change our habits. But the complex remains untouched, lurking in the shadows of the unconscious, waiting for its moment to seize the operational controls. Consider the complex as a magnetic core of unintegrated trauma or repressed instinct. Because the ego found the original content unbearable, too painful, too shameful, too morally conflicting, it was shoved into the darkness. But repression does not dissolve energy. It merely structures it. That energy coalesces around the core, giving the complex its autonomy. When the complex is activated, by stress, by a specific relationship, or by the breakdown of the persona, it hijacks the entire system. You decide today that you will maintain sobriety, but the addiction complex, which operates outside your conscious moral framework, is triggered by a seemingly minor stressor. It floods your system with a specific emotional state, a compulsion, and a detailed plan of action. The conscious ego, which was so resolute hours earlier, suddenly finds itself paralyzed, rationalizing, or completely absent. You are driving the car, but the complex is steering. You watch, horrified, as your body executes a course of action you consciously despise. That feeling of dissociation, of watching yourself self-destruct, that is the complex demonstrating its superior psychic power. This mechanism is why people repeat the same catastrophic mistakes across decades. They fall for the same destructive partner, they sabotage the same career opportunity, they recreate the exact emotional climate of their childhood trauma. This is not coincidence. This is the compulsion to repeat, dictated by the autonomous complex demanding resolution, or, failing that, demanding energy. These complexes are insatiable. They drain the conscious reservoir of energy, leaving the individual exhausted, fragmented, and chronically confused. The ego, starved of its own vitality, becomes weak and prone to further collapse. This is the defining characteristic of severe neurosis. a psyche divided, with the majority of its functional power residing in unconscious, self-destructive structures. The moment the persona cracks open, the moment that social facade fails, the complexes rush the gates. They are the reason the Negredo feels like utter madness. It is not just the loss of identity, it is the sudden realization that the house is full of strangers who are now running the household. Since the ego cannot tolerate the idea that these destructive forces are internal, it employs the mechanism of projection. This is where the epidemic of social sickness begins. The complex must be lived out, but if the ego cannot bear the internal confrontation, it pushes the content outward. The individual then experiences the internal tyrant as an external persecutor. The power complex that demands ruthless control, if repressed, is projected onto the boss, the government, or a political figure. The inferiority complex is projected onto society, which is perceived as constantly judging and undermining the individual. The world, therefore, becomes a mirror reflecting the unintegrated contents of the unconscious. You do not see reality, you see your projections. You hate the person who embodies the trait you desperately deny in yourself. You fight the battle externally, expending vast amounts of psychic energy fighting phantoms, while the real enemy, the complex, remains safely hidden within your own structure, dictating the terms of the war. This is psychological suicide. You are sacrificing your consciousness, your potential for growth, and your sanity to maintain the illusion that the problem resides outside your skin. The only way to disarm an autonomous complex is to withdraw the projection, recognize the content as belonging to your own structure, and begin the arduous, painful process of integration. This is the essence of individuation. It is the process of reclaiming the energy held captive by these split-off fragments. This requires brutal honesty. It demands that you stop blaming the world, stop medicating the discomfort, and stop running back to the shattered ruins of the persona. You must look directly at the complex, at the rage, the self-pity, the perverse desire for destruction, and say, "This too is me." If you refuse this confrontation, the complexes will continue their autonomous reign. They will ensure that your life remains a repetitive cycle of self-sabotage and external conflict. They will reduce the possibility of genuine conscious life to zero. You will not achieve peace. You will simply achieve psychic paralysis. The choice is stark, and it permits no compromise. Either you assume the terrifying responsibility of integrating your own internal tyrants, or you surrender your life completely to their unconscious destructive command. There is no middle ground in the psyche. The work must begin now, while you still retain enough consciousness to initiate the fight. Wait too long, and the complex will consume the remaining light. The most lethal psychological trap during this phase of disintegration, the moment the old self is dying, is the mechanism of projection. It is a cheap, immediate trick the psyche plays on itself to avoid the intolerable pain of self-recognition. We project because the contents of the newly exposed shadow are too heavy, too morally ambiguous, for the fragile ego to bear. When the persona cracks, all the repressed malice, the infantile rage, the envy, the profound sense of inadequacy, and the unlived possibilities flood the conscious structure. The ego, terrified of drowning in its own filth, instinctively throws this material outward. The psychological reality is simple, brutal, and utterly non-negotiable. The villain of your story is you, projected outside. Look closely at the person, the group, or the institution you despise most vehemently. The object of your obsessive, irrational hatred is almost certainly the screen upon which you are displaying your own unacknowledged complexes. You are not seeing the external world as it is. You are seeing your own rejected reality reflected back in agonizing clarity. This is not a matter of moral judgment. It is a clinical observation of how the human psychic system operates under stress. Projection is the primary engine of collective neurosis. It allows the individual to maintain a pristine, morally superior image of themselves, the victim, the righteous crusader, the innocent bystander, while simultaneously discharging vast quantities of destructive unconscious energy. Consider the man who spends his entire life railing against the corruption and hypocrisy of his colleagues or the government. His moral fury is immense, his arguments precise, his dedication absolute. Yet in his personal life, he is a small tyrant, subtly manipulating his family, avoiding accountability, and practicing the very petty deceits he condemns in others. He cannot see his own duplicity because the complex of the tyrant, which resides within him, has been fully externalized and attached to his boss or his political rival. He is psychologically dependent on that external enemy existing, because without it, he would be forced to confront the tyrant within his own skin. This refusal to withdraw the projection is not just a personal failure. It is a profound act of psychological suicide. Every piece of energy you invest in hating the external target is energy stolen from your own individuation process. You are handing the reins of your own destiny over to an externalized fantasy. You are sacrificing your consciousness, your potential for growth, and your sanity to maintain the illusion that the problem resides outside your skin. The complexes, once projected, gain an autonomous life in the world. They infect the collective. When millions of people are projecting their unintegrated shadows onto an external group, whether defined by race, ideology, or geography, you do not merely have social conflict. You have a full-blown psychic epidemic, a mass psychosis where reality is entirely superseded by the internal contents of the unconscious. This is why society seems so riddled with irrational, self-destructive conflicts. We are not fighting over facts or resources. We are fighting over our own unlived lives and our own rejected darkness. The collective mind is simply the sum of all these individual projections running rampant. If you are currently experiencing the shattering of the persona, the emptiness, the loss of meaning, the fear, you must understand that this is the precise moment when the temptation to project is strongest. The shadow is standing at the door. Your first instinct will be to find someone, anyone, to blame for your discomfort, your failure, or your existential dread. Do not take the bait. To take the bait is to regress instantly, to leap backward from the threshold of transformation back into the familiar, suffocating prison of the old self. You will exchange the difficult path toward consciousness for the easy, addictive comfort of victimhood. The only way to disarm an autonomous complex is to withdraw the projection. This is the cold, hard truth. You must recognize the content as belonging to your own structure. This recognition is agonizing. It demands that you stop blaming the world, stop medicating the discomfort, and stop running back to the shattered ruins of the persona. You must look directly at the complex, at the rage, the self-pity, the perverse desire for destruction, and say, "This too is me." This is not an endorsement of the destructive act, but an acknowledgement of the capacity for it. The moment you own the capacity, you reclaim the energy. The complex loses its external power source and becomes, once again, a piece of raw psychic material that can be analyzed and integrated, rather than an autonomous tyrant controlling your behavior from the shadows. This is the essence of individuation. It is the process of reclaiming the energy held captive by these split-off fragments. It requires brutal honesty. It demands that you stop operating under the lie that you are purely good and the world is purely evil. That duality is the signature of the neurotic mind. If you refuse this confrontation, the complexes will continue their autonomous reign. They will ensure that your life remains a repetitive cycle of self-sabotage and external conflict. You will repeatedly attract the same type of conflict, the same type of betrayer, the same pattern of injustice, because you are unconsciously sending out a signal: I need an external vessel for my own repressed shadow. The refusal to integrate will reduce the possibility of genuine conscious life to zero. You will not achieve peace. You will simply achieve psychic paralysis. You will live out your days as a half-formed ghost, endlessly fighting a war outside that should have been fought inside. The choice is stark, and it permits no compromise. Either you assume the terrifying responsibility of integrating your own internal tyrants, or you surrender your life completely to their unconscious destructive command. There is no middle ground in the psyche. The work must begin now, while you still retain enough consciousness to initiate the fight. Wait too long, and the complex will consume the remaining light. You will die before you ever truly live. The terrifying responsibility of integration is not about becoming a better person in the saccharine sense society demands. It is about becoming a whole person, which means accepting the cold, hard truth. You are not merely a victim of external circumstances, and you are capable of genuine malice. This is where most people bail out. They want the benefits of individuation, the clarity, the strength, without paying the price of self-loathing. But you must confront the fact that the complexes running your life, the ones causing the endless cycle of neurotic repetition, are fueled by the energy of your repressed potential for destruction. Shadow integration is not a cure. It is the conscious assimilation of the unacceptable content of your psyche. You are not trying to eliminate your capacity for rage, cruelty, or selfishness. That is impossible. You are trying to drag that energy out of the unconscious basement where it plots autonomous sabotage and bring it into the light of consciousness, where you can control the trigger. Consider the man who prides himself on being endlessly compassionate and forgiving. He projects his own capacity for justified anger onto political figures or historical villains. He sees the world as fundamentally corrupt and himself as the only beacon of light. This is a lie. His repressed aggression does not vanish. It turns inward, manifesting as chronic anxiety, or it leaks out as passive-aggressive sabotage in his closest relationships. He becomes a psychological martyr, demanding perpetual sympathy, while unconsciously punishing those who fail to meet his impossible standard of purity. To integrate his shadow, he must look into the mirror and acknowledge, I am capable of hatred. I am capable of calculated destruction. I possess the instinct to dominate. This admission is the psychological sacrifice required. Once he owns his potential for darkness, he stops projecting it onto the world, and the world suddenly appears less monstrous. He gains a terrible power, the ability to consciously deploy his aggression when necessary, instead of being unconsciously deployed by it. This is why the process feels like a mental breakdown. The comforting lie of your moral identity is shattered. You realize you have been living as a fractured caricature. Once the individual starts this arduous internal work, a new danger arises, the pressure of the mass. When you begin to form a genuine, non-projected self, you become a psychological irritant to the collective. Society, which is essentially a herd of mutually projecting neurotics, depends on your conformity. It demands that you keep your complexes repressed so that they can be conveniently projected onto external scapegoats. To survive the individuation process, you need psychological armor. This armor is not built from external achievements or social approval. It is built from a strategic posture of distance. We must cultivate what I term holy indifference. Holy indifference is not apathy. It is the refusal to be psychically hooked by the collective noise, the opinions, the moral panics, the manufactured outrage, and the endless demand for validation. When you are engaged in the profound, dangerous work of integrating your shadow, you cannot afford to waste psychic energy defending yourself against the projections of others. The moment you stand outside the collective, the herd will attempt to drag you back in, usually through judgment, ridicule, or accusations of moral failure. They are trying to re-establish their comfortable projection mechanism. If you react, if you argue, if you try to explain your complex inner reality to the simplistic demands of the collective consciousness, you lose. You surrender the energy you need for internal transformation. Therefore, the second vital defense is strategic silence. Learn to keep your own counsel. The newly forming individual consciousness is fragile. It is like a small flame in a strong wind. Do not expose it to the cynical, corrosive breath of the crowd. The individual who is integrating their shadow realizes that most conversations are not exchanges of ideas, but exchanges of neuroses. They are opportunities for people to dump their unwanted contents onto you, hoping you will carry the burden of their complexes. Learn to listen without absorption. Observe the projection without accepting the role assigned to you. The ultimate goal of individuation is the creation of a stable, self-contained structure, a functional psychic structure that can withstand the storms of the unconscious and the tyranny of the mass. The alternative is psychological suicide. The modern human being is constantly tempted to dissolve into the collective. We see this pathology everywhere: the desperate need for consensus, the slavish devotion to ephemeral trends, the inability to hold a unique, uncomfortable thought. When you lose your individuality, you lose your ethical compass and your capacity for consciousness. You become a mere cell in a massive, unconscious organism, a complex autonomo writ large. The mass operates purely on instinct and projection. It is inherently dangerous. It offers comfort, but that comfort is the cold paralysis of the tomb. If you refuse the painful, solitary path of individuation, The psychological cost will be total. You will achieve a life of apparent external success, perhaps, but inside, the complex will rule supreme. You will die full of unlived life, a ghost haunted by the man you refused to become. The time for retreat is over. The process has started. The old self is dying. Your only choice now is whether you participate consciously in this necessary dissolution or whether you allow the unconscious to complete the job through a full-blown mental breakdown that leaves you ruined and scattered. You must stand alone in the fire. There is no other path out of the neurosis. This is the critical juncture. The old structure is collapsing. You are standing ankle-deep in the raw sewage of your own unconscious. Most people, when they reach this point, the true psychological checkpoint, panic. They mistake the necessary decomposition for a fatal illness. The modern analyst, the doctor of the surface, offers comfort. They offer medication to dull the ache, therapy to return you to the normal state of unconscious conformity. They tell you to fix the symptoms of the breakdown. This is the ultimate betrayal of the self. This is advising a patient to sew their own wounds shut before the infection has been cleaned out. The choice is brutally binary, and it is here that the cold, hard truth of existence slams home. You either accept the agonizing responsibility of consciousness, or you regress entirely into the comforting yet deadly embrace of collective neurosis. If you choose regression, the path is easy. You simply put the old mask back on. You force yourself back into the relationships, the career, the beliefs that define the cracked persona. You seek consensus, you demand external validation, and you project the terrifying contents of your shadow onto the nearest convenient scapegoat, a political enemy, a cultural trend, or a person you envy. The immediate result is relief. A sense of false stability returns. But this stability is the paralysis of psychological suicide. You become a walking corpse, a ghost haunting a life full of unlived possibilities. The complexes you refuse to integrate do not simply vanish. They recede into the darkness, gaining strength. They become truly autonomous, ruling your life from the shadows, dictating compulsive behaviors, fueling irrational fears, and ensuring that your life remains a monument to the man or woman you refuse to become. Decades later, this repressed material will erupt, often manifesting as a severe physical ailment or a catastrophic late-stage mental breakdown, a price paid in full for refusing the voluntary death. Consciousness, conversely, is a heavy, solitary burden. It demands that you stand alone in the fire. Individuation is not about achieving some state of bliss or spiritual enlightenment. It is about forging a stable, self-contained psychic structure capable of holding the tension of opposites. It means integrating the shadow, that dark, rejected material, not eliminating it. It means looking at the things you hate most about yourself, naming them, and realizing that they are functional parts of your whole structure. This process feels like tearing off your own skin, layer by layer, because you are destroying the comfortable lie you have lived for decades. This is why the collective hates the individual who individuates. The mass is fundamentally unconscious. It operates purely on instinct, projection, and shared delusion. It offers the easy path of shared guilt and shared righteousness. When you choose the solitary path, when you withdraw your projections and begin to carry your own ethical weight, you become an anomaly. You expose the neurosis of the collective by your mere existence. The pressure to conform right now, in this state of dissolution, will be immense. Your friends will worry. Your family will demand you get back to normal. Society will offer 1,000 cheap solutions to pull you back into the collective sleep. Reject them all. Your task is to hold the chaos. You must sit in the emptiness and the terror. The feeling of meaninglessness, that gray, blank void, is the necessary phase of the nigredo, the blackening. The old meaning system, the one built on the shaky foundation of the persona and external expectations, has died. The new meaning, the one derived from your own deep instinct and integrated unconscious contents, has not yet been born. You are suspended between worlds. Do not run back to the persona. Do not seek the comfort of the mass. Do not medicate away the profound, necessary pain. Instead, turn your focus inward. Analyze the dreams, the sudden mood shifts, the obsessive thoughts. These are not random intrusions. They are the complex's autonomos speaking. They are the suppressed contents of the personal unconscious demanding integration. Name them. Define their boundaries. By bringing them into the light of consciousness, You strip them of their power to rule you autonomously. This is the only way to cease being the puppet of your own trauma. We are living through an epidemic of neurosis. The modern human is dangerously detached from the instinctual basis of the psyche, yet simultaneously overwhelmed by the raw, untamed power of the collective unconscious. We have built a world that rewards superficiality and punishes depth. The result is a society full of outwardly successful individuals who are, internally, hollowed-out shells ruled by unnamed terrors. The dissolution you are experiencing is not a failure. It is the prerequisite for becoming conscious. But understand this: the choice is absolute. There is no half measure here. You cannot keep one foot in the old life and one foot on the path of individuation. You either sacrifice the comfort of the known self to the fire of consciousness, or you surrender your autonomy to the complexes and the mass. If you refuse the transformation now, the price later will be total psychological ruin. The foundation of your psychic structure is currently exposed. Build it stronger. Build it alone. The time for deliberation is over. The process has started. Stand in the wreckage. The world needs individuals capable of conscious thought, not consensus seekers dissolving into the collective fever. If you are willing to face the actual contents of the abyss, if you are ready to do the brutal work of integrating your shadow and resisting the pull of the mass, then you must dedicate yourself to this rigorous path. The neurosis of the world will only be healed when enough individuals have the courage to heal themselves. Do the work. If you are serious about escaping the collective neurosis and forging a self that can withstand the inevitable storms, then understand that this is not a journey for the faint of heart. This is clinical survival.